I had general discussions when I was in Moscow in October, a meeting with senior Soviet officials and Marshal Yazov about the situation in the Gulf. I think it would be fair to say that it was their view that Saddam Hussein did not possess any significant capability that we were unaware of. They described the systems that they'd provided to him as systems that were generally available, like T-72 tanks to their allies. Specifically, we talked about the Scud. He made it clear then that there was no guidance system for the Scud. It's just a ballistic missile that goes wherever it goes. It's not a highly accurate or a very sophisticated system. I think probably the greatest two contributions the Soviets have made to this venture. One has been their cooperation and support of the policy in the United Nations, which has been very significant. And the other is that they have shut off the flow of arms exports to Iraq. The situation we're faced with today would be far more difficult if Saddam Hussein were able to get resupplied in terms of the key pieces of military equipment that we've been working to destroy.
Sir, how effective have the Iraqis been at repairing the damage to their airfields and other targets? And how effective have they been at fooling you with decoys in their Scud missile department?
They use decoys. They're quite good at it. I'll let the chart I used earlier as to which airfields are active speak for itself. They obviously are hard at work repairing some of the damage. We've seen it. We've also seen them paint damage on airfields to spoof us into thinking that it is still damaged, and therefore we don't have to worry about it. There are also reports that they are trying to put out dummy Scud systems. This isn't a surprise to us because they have a long history and did it throughout the Iran-Iraq war of using dummies in order to confuse their enemy. They probably are also making some efforts to take totally destroyed facilities and cover them over quickly to make them appear as if they're not totally destroyed to lure us into coming back. But I think our analysts and our targeteers are quite sophisticated. They're the best in the world, and they will be sensitive to the possibility of dummy installations and false repairs.
One at a time, please. Just raise your hand and we'll call.
General Powell, General, on the air power question. You've indicated 19 killed in air combat maneuvers for the Wood dogfights, another 22 on the ground, or at least that was the inference I got.
It's a number that changes every few hours as we get BDA assessment, and yeah. Got 3 more just as we walked in, 2 Badgers, and some Badgers have been destroyed in the ground.
We're talking about roughly 50 aircraft gone, if we assume that. It still leaves roughly 750 left. Do you have any indication the Iraqis are doing a move and hide strategy? Perhaps to some of these dispersal fields that there was damage done, but they still have support facilities there to operate air power. Is that concerning you, especially since if they rebuild, they could put up a mass wave of 200, 300, 400 aircraft all of a sudden?
I attribute that capability to them. In addition to the facilities you saw on that map, they're probably using highways and other things like that. And so we assume that they have that capability. They did not use it in the first 7 days of the war. They did not challenge us with defensive air. They have not tried to attack us with offensive air. But that does not mean we are not on the lookout for it, or we're not alert to it, or we are unmindful of the threat it represents. It does represent a threat, but it's a threat we understand, we believe we are quite able to deal with, and rather than spend air power now trying to run the body count up on airplanes that are not bothering us at the moment, I'd rather use that air power in more efficient ways against things that are more immediate relevance to our battle plan.
There have been reports that at least one other country in the area is providing a sanctuary for Iraqi aircraft or other equipment. Do you have any evidence at all to support or
I've seen those reports and I can't confirm them. Mike, do you?
Michael? And General Powell, I'd like to ask you to expand a little bit on what you infer the Iraqi military strategy to be. You said what their actions could be part of a strategy. Does the Iraqi military response to date, that is, the absence of a response, surprise you? Were you surprised by that? Do you think it's an attempt to engage us in a costly land war? And a related question, General Powell said that implied that we hope not to have to use ground forces. At the same time, he said the Republican Guards will lie low, and that the only way we may determine if they survived attack is if they're forced to move. Does that mean we'll have to bring in our ground forces in order to determine whether we've knocked them out?
Don't know yet. The strategy right now, it seems to me, is they are hunkering down. I mean, it's obvious. I suspect, and not being an Iraqi general, I don't have complete insight into what they may be thinking, but I would suspect that right now they are hunkering down, and they probably are questioning whether we can keep this up for an extended period of time, and whether or not the political will and public support will be there to keep this up for an extended period of time. And I'm sure they're making an assessment day by day on what their losses are, and making their own judgment as to how long they can sustain this kind of punishment. I would be the happiest guy in the world if one day one bomb goes in on a Republican Guard unit and they say, that's it, we break, can't take anymore, we're heading home, and they leave. But I can't plan on that. And so what I'm putting in place, and what General Schwarzkopf is putting in place, I should say, and the campaign plan that General Schwarzkopf has worked out, is to anticipate that at the end of the day, when they are so weakened that we believe the time is right and air power alone won't do it, we're prepared to take this to a successful conclusion using other means of combat power besides air power. That's been a consistent...
Is this the response that you anticipated in planning your campaign by the Iraqi military low strategy?
At this, I'd rather not say what I anticipated, because it might give Mr. Hussein some insight into what I'm anticipating now.
General,
young lady,
Mr. Secretary, can you tell us, you said a minute ago that Saddam Hussein cannot change the basic course of this conflict. He will be defeated. Can you tell us, is there any reason to believe that he and his circle of advisors believes that? Whether, and what are you doing to make him believe that? And if you're not doing anything, why not?
Well, I think if it was difficult before the conflict started to try to assess Saddam Hussein's mental attitude and his thinking about all of these kinds of issues, it's probably even more difficult now. No press left in Baghdad, very little diplomatic communication through other countries. We know less today about what's going on inside Saddam Hussein's mind than we did then, so it'd be risky business for us, I think, to make judgments about that. It may well be that he does not have as much information as we do about the impact we've had on his forces, that having in many cases damaged his command and control system and had the impact that Colin shows with respect to his air capability, etc., that he simply doesn't know how badly he's been hit. And I think ultimately he'll get the message. I would hope that he will. And we are determined, in terms of the statement I made, to achieve our military objective, which is to do what the President's directed us to do, which is to get Saddam Hussein out of Kuwait.
Is it part of the plan that he should not know, in that, would you like to visit a minimum level of destruction, for instance, upon the Republican Guard before he knows it?
Well, it's difficult to refine it that carefully. I mean, once you start military action, you can go after those specific targets we've laid out there, but we believe the Republican Guard is at the heart of his military capability and his political power. That's the unit that he used to take Kuwait. Those are the units that he used in his war with Iran for offensive purposes. They are the heart of the regime. And we're not really trying to fine-tune it. We'll hit the Republican Guard just as hard as we have to until we've achieved our objective.
Mr. Secretary, we know that he has in the past several days demonstrated a capability to put salvos of Scuds over major cities from Tel Aviv across the area to the Persian Gulf. If he marries them now with chemical weapons, poison gas or other, are we prepared, and would we respond in kind?
We have to be concerned about the possibility that he may have chemical capability that he could marry up with his ballistic missiles. He's never previously used ballistic missiles with chemical warheads on them, but we have to assume he could. It's one of the reasons for the elaborate alarm systems we've worked out, both in Saudi Arabia and that the Israelis have worked out, the protective gear that our troops are equipped with, etc. In terms of how we might respond were he to use chemical weapons, I would simply reiterate what we've said previously, which is that the United States has a broad spectrum of capabilities available, that the President would make the decision about how we might respond to an unconventional attack by Saddam Hussein against U.S. or allied forces, and I wouldn't want to speculate further.
Secretary, could I ask you a couple of questions? First of all, about the report of a coup attempt. Have you heard anything about this at all within Iraq?
Nothing that would give me any reason to believe it has great credence.
And Mr. General Powell, I have another question about the Exocets. We talked about the Silkworth being taken out, but you didn't say anything about the Exocets, and many people think that's one of the most effective weapon systems he has. It's very effective in the Falklands conflict. Have you done anything to take out the Exocets?
The Navy's working on it. They're of limited range and don't represent a very serious threat at the moment.
Thank you. You were saying before that the coalition would take as long as it had to, and yet you've outlined some goals that look like they might last along. That you said that you want to rip up the Air Force, yet they still have some 750 planes, and you said you wanted to shut up the Army with cutting off its communications, which is still very resilient, a very large army. The chemical weapon threat is still a threat to the Allied, and the Scud is still a weapon of terror for the Allies. Does that not sound like it's going to last some time?
Well, we've avoided consistently putting any sort of artificial deadline out there by which this whole operation had to be completed. We do not know how long it will last. Those are the kinds of things you mentioned, our specific objectives. We will operate until we've achieved those objectives, and I simply wouldn't want to put a time frame on it. I can't do that. I don't know how long it will take, although I'm inclined to think, given the size of the force we've deployed and the success we've enjoyed to date, that it won't take that long.
But is the Allied force patience going to outlast the patience of Saddam Hussein, who's hunkering down? Which patience is going to outlast?
Well, there's no doubt in my mind, but what the United States and our allies in this venture have the staying power to see to it that the job gets done, that he will quit long before we will.
Secretary Cheney and actually General Powell, you're mentioning now that your main focus is the Republican Guards. Does that mean at this juncture in the air campaign, you're pretty much sparing the troops right at the front line?
No, they are under attack as well. We're selectively probing against all of the forces in the Kuwaiti theater of operations. But because the Republican Guard is the Republican Guard, they get more attention than the rest.
What about the
Secretary, on the Scud threat, what percentage of the Scud launchers would you say have mobile and fixed have been destroyed, and how well are the Allies on the way towards destroying the full Scud capability so that the Saudis and the Israelis won't have to worry about that?
I don't think you can put a hard percentage on the amount of his capability that's been destroyed. We know he had a large number of missiles before this started. The missiles are important, but the launchers are even more important. We know we've been able to attack successfully many of the fixed sites. We continue to work on those fixed sites. We know he's got mobile capability, but we have some confidence we've destroyed some of that mobile capability. But it's a nebulous kind of thing. They're relatively small pieces of equipment. They can hide in the desert. They can come out at night and launch. It doesn't require any great degree of sophistication for them to be able to operate. And it's one of those problems that may be with us for some period of time, and that it's a matter of reducing the odds as much as possible, going aggressively after his launch capability, but also defending the targets, which is why we've deployed Patriot both in Saudi Arabia and Israel.
Who fired the Patriot that apparently hit or didn't hit the Scud that did the damage in Tel Aviv yesterday?
IDF.
Why did they do it instead of the U.S. crews?
Well, either one could have done it, whoever was in position. The U.S. crew was working with a power problem, a generator problem they had at the time, and IDF got acquisition and fired.
Did that Patriot hit the Scud?
I really would prefer to defer to the IDF to comment on their actions. I'm just passing on a report I heard.
Secretary, just going back to an earlier line of questioning, what is your view of the argument that, in fact, if Saddam Hussein's strategy is simply to stretch this war out as long as possible, forcing the Allied troops into a long, bloody ground war, he's enjoying some success in that? How do you view that, and is there anything you can really do if he continues to husband his resources as he's been doing?
Well, I'm not a military strategist to the extent that my colleague General Powell might be, but looking at it from the perspective U.S. forces versus Iraqi forces, he really hasn't got much choice at this point. I mean, he is pursuing a strategy, perhaps of necessity. If he comes up with his air forces in significant numbers, I think we'll see the kind of ratio that Colin talked about in terms of 19-0 or 19-1 on his entire air force, and he would lose it and gain very little for it. He doesn't have any significant naval capability. He's really left with a very large army. That's always been the heart of his military strength, and his success in the Iran-Iraq war was to dig in and hunker down and defend against the human wave assaults by Iranian teenagers. That's not the kind of situation he's faced with today, and I think the reason he will not be successful with a weighted-out strategy is that as long as he is sitting there waiting, we are steadily and progressively destroying his unconventional warfare capability, finding and destroying his Scuds, taking out his Air Force piece by piece, and now, as the chairman pointed out, aggressively working over his ground forces in Kuwait. I think time is clearly on our side, and that given our dominance in the air and our capability to do significant damage to his ground forces, that each day, each week that goes by, he gets weaker and we get stronger.
But you stated your goal, though, is to get his troops out of Kuwait, and in fact, while this pummeling continues, his troops remain still reasonably intact, which suggests that it's inevitable that he will draw the Allies into a ground war.
Well, we may eventually, and I'll defer to General Powell and General Schwarzkopf. They'll have to come back and advise me and the President on when various pieces of the campaign kick in. But if we do have to go to using our ground forces to push him out of Kuwait, it will be after we've done enormous damage to his ground forces, after they've been significantly weakened. And I think our people have the same capability on the ground to display the kind of mastery over Iraqi forces that they've displayed in the air to date.
Thank you very much, sir. The aircraft that you're showing us as destroyed on the ground, are those confirmed wreckages, or are you including in that any estimate of
the ones I'm showing you? The ones I'm showing you are confirmed, and we had a couple of more confirmed as we were walking down here. And as the BDA gets better and as the attack progresses, that number will grow. We're not doing estimates. And we're trying to be as forthcoming as we can. I'm not down here to give you a happy talk. I'm trying to give you my best assessment as I know it now. Don't know how long the war will take. It's a war. I don't think we've done badly for 7 days, and I don't think we're by no means bogged down. And we'll try to give you as much information as we can. And we'll give you that which we can confirm. What we can't do is try to keep up with the hourly news cycle. That's causing us a great deal of work.
There's been some talk at this news conference about the danger of the Scud missiles and the response of the U.S. Patriots, 1102 in Saudi Arabia. And at this moment, Patriots are being launched from Dhahran in eastern Saudi Arabia. We'll keep you up to date.
That generally showed the scheme of coverage that they had on the first day.
How about collateral damage?
Yes.
Collateral damage?
I think we have been awfully good in avoiding collateral damage. An enormous amount of work went into the targeting for this operation. I can't say that there was no collateral damage, but some of the claims that have been out there that we have struck religious and cultural sites, I have seen no hard evidence to suggest we did that. I can make no estimate. How could I be? I'm standing here.
I didn't know whether it come to you before you came in.
I've been here for an hour. I don't know that.
General, this one you were anyone.
Thank you.
General Colin Powell and the Secretary of Defense, Dick Cheney, a very lengthy briefing there, over an hour on the current military situation, and we'll get to it in the fullest way in just a second. But is Sam Donaldson standing by in Eastern Saudi Arabia? Let's go straight to Sam Donaldson. Yeah. Sam, what's cooking?
Yeah. Peter.
Go ahead, Sam.
Rick, get out of my ear, Rick. Get out of my ear, Rick. Peter, are you there?
I am,
Peter,
Sam.
Are you there?
I am, Sam. Go ahead.
Yes, you're looking at the night sky here in Dhahran. We were under a Scud attack at the very end of that briefing. As Cheney and Powell were talking, at least 5 of our own rockets went up, and we heard 2 very loud explosions, intercept explosions. But one of the explosions, and I'm going to be very careful about this, on the other side of the hotel where I'm standing, sounded like it was very low to the ground. Whether that was an intercept low to the ground or whether, in fact, the Scud hit the ground, we don't know. We're sending people right now to try to find out. The sirens are still sounding here in Dhahran, but at the moment the sky does appear to be clear, Peter.
Okay, Sam, thanks very much. We'll come back to you in just a little while. The sirens are also sounding in Riyadh in central Saudi Arabia, and they are also going off in Jerusalem at the moment, and we shall go to any one of those locations the moment that we know something more. But Sam Donaldson reporting that the Patriots have been fired off in eastern Saudi Arabia. Sometimes correspondents refer to the Patriots being very close. They are designed, for those of you who've learned something about weapons during this campaign, which is now 1 week old, it is a close-in weapon. It's designed not to go a long distance before it hits its target, so that is often why it is in the range, certainly within earshot, but also often within range of the television cameras. Now, this was the most extensive briefing you and we have had from the Secretary of Defense and the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs since this campaign began almost 7 days ago. It covers a very wide variety of subjects, and there are a number of people with us this afternoon who are much better at listening to these briefings than those of us who are laymen. And so let me introduce 2 of them to you in the first instance. Our 2 resident military analysts, General Bernard Traynor on the left, who's in Los Angeles today, and Tony Cordesman in Washington. I'll give you my impression, gentlemen. You tell me whether I'm right and wrong. Colin Powell, the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs, makes it sound like an awesome, efficient operation against the Iraqis. General Traynor.
Yes, Peter, I think it was largely a reassurance brief. There was very little hard data given, but I think there was one signal that came through, and that is that there's going to be a prolonged air campaign before there's ever a ground operation launched.
And anything else?
Well, I think that's the main feature of this. I think there's been some speculation that there was going to be a rather rapid movement to ground operations in conjunction with the air campaign. But I think the signal here today was that they're going to continue to try to do this thing by air, and I think they used the term then using ground forces if necessary. And obviously the Republican Guards are kind of the centerpiece of the attack against the ground forces.
Well, I thought I saw more news into that, so let me play amateur here and play it off on you and also then come to Tony Cordesman. But General Traynor, first of all, quite an astonishingly confident statement from General Powell about air superiority. I taught it, he said, we have it. Is that not news?
I don't think there's any question that we have air superiority. People were arguing semantics. There is in the war colleges a distinction between air superiority and air supremacy, with air supremacy meaning that the enemy has absolutely no capability to do anything. But within military circles, the traditionally accepted definition of air superiority is, as General Powell indicated, that you can do what you want in the air for all practical purposes, but the other fellow still has some sort of capability to interfere, but not materially interfere with what you want to do.
Okay, before we go to Tony Cordesman, let's go to Israel, where ABC's Bill Siemens is standing by. Bill, bring us up, please.
Peter, the air raid sirens are sounding again right now as I speak to you. They began sounding their wailing alarm of another missile attack just a few minutes ago. The military spokesman is broadcasting on the emergency TV and radio channels, telling the public again to get into their gas-proof rooms and put on their gas masks. I have no information on any hits or strikes. It is too soon, but there is another air raid alarm here in Israel right now.
Okay, thanks, Bill Siemens. He will keep us up to date, as Sam Donaldson will in eastern Saudi Arabia. You heard a lot about the Scuds at the briefing there. They're elusive. The Iraqis have put up decoy Scuds in some cases. Sometimes it's a sophisticated operation. Sometimes it's just a rail on the back of a flatbed truck, and they put it up like this so they can fire off it. So that's That continues to be a major distraction from the overall campaign for a lot of people. But Tony Cordesman, let me ask you a question about the Scuds. It's a weapon of terror, as the Secretary said, but it isn't truly relevant to the overall military campaign, is it?
It's only relevant if it does have a chemical warhead or if it continues to tie up large amounts of military assets. It is conceivable. There are two terror ways in which it could be used. They could put some sort of radioactive material in it. It would not then be effective, but I think it would have a devastating effect initially till people realized it was not serious. The same would be true of a biological agent. Just the knowledge that it existed would have a major effect.
Okay, the sirens, by the way, are still going in Jerusalem, but they have now stopped in Tel Aviv. Tony Cordesman, let me go back to some of the things that General Powell said and get your assessment of them in terms of major news or not. On the question of the nuclear facility, 2 operating reactors are down, finished.
Well, Peter, I don't think that's particularly meaningful. They're easy targets. It certainly has meaning for the future. What he did not talk about, and what most people think the prime nuclear threat is there, is a centrifuge effort which is underground. So we may get further qualification on that with time.
Okay, and the uranium can be stored away. When the Iraqis hit the Osiris reactor in 1981, I think it was, they left some uranium intact, right?
There are 12.7 kilograms, which some people feel can be made into a nuclear device and others think is too sophisticated. It's very likely that that has been dispersed outside the area and is probably intact and in Iraqi hands.
Chemical facilities, their emphasis on production facilities and the factory to put it into weapons, considerable damage to both. What does that mean to us?
Well, I think it's very important in affecting their future production, but as General Powell was very careful to qualify, and Peter, I would listen to his qualifications at least as much to the positive statements. It's clear that all of the basic stockpiles of chemical weapons have not been attacked. Those are thousands of tons of weapons, that he retains all of the delivery systems that could encounter our forces as they advanced into Kuwait, and he retains the ability to use his aircraft in some kind of last-ditch raids to launch large amounts of chemical bombs.
I'll come back to the Air Force if I may, but one more. Their biological facilities created quite a problem for them. That formula factory was a biological target. He was very insistent on that, and we have, he said, taken it out.
Well, I think that, again, we're talking production. We have to be careful that he probably has dispersed any of the weapons that he may have, so those will be intact. The problem of underground facilities is difficult, and unlike chemical facilities, biological facilities can be very small and very easy to hide.
Let me come back to this, nothing new in Jerusalem, by the way. Their sirens have been going in Jerusalem. They've stopped in Tel Aviv, nothing new there. ABC's Barry Dunsmore reports that at least 2 Patriots were fired in Riyadh. That's the Saudi capital in central Saudi Arabia. No report of Scuds landing or an intercept taking place there. General Traynor, if I may come back to you, there was a lot of discussion about command and control, whether Saddam Hussein and his senior officers are still in control of their military. General Powell says they're very good, they haven't lost it. How does that affect the campaign?
Oh, considerably. After all, Saddam Hussein is setting the policy and his general staff is directing the defensive operations, and to do that effectively, they're going to need command and control. Now, the general staff knew about our air capability, and they clearly have set up a redundant command and control system so that if one system goes down, they can still move to another one. And I don't think we can ever fully expect to destroy their command, control, and communications, because even if we did it, it would only be temporary. They have some very bright electrical types there that can put the operation back together by jury rigging. So the best we can hope, I think, is to degrade, certainly not to destroy the command and control.
Both you and Tony Cordesman know the Iraqi Army. One of the things that I think impresses laymen is their ability to get things going again. Paint over runways at one point, he said, to make it look as if they are damaged. How accomplished are the Iraqis, do you think, in that regard?
Oh, I think the Iraqis are very clever. You know, these are professional officers running this show. They have studied warfare in various parts of the world. The idea of putting a false impression on an airfield probably came from the Falklands campaign when the Argentinians did that to fool the British airstrikes. So these are people who are, in a sense, desperate, but they're determined and they're very innovative when put under pressure.
Before we turn to the specifics of the Iraqi army in Kuwait, I want to turn a little to the political dimension of this because so many people of different political persuasions and interests around the country have been listening to this almost purely military briefing today. There are a lot of people in the U.S. And in Europe, as we have seen over the last several days, not to mention in the Muslim world opposed to the war effort. We are joined today by Ramsey Clark, the former Attorney General who went to Baghdad on a diplomatic effort trying to stop the war before it began. Mr. Clark, when you listened to the briefing, what's your impression?
Well, I remembered from 30 years watching such briefings that the Pentagon never knows as much as it claims, never tells as much as it knows, and doesn't tell the truth about things that it doesn't care to tell the truth about. It did convince me of one thing, however, and that is that their purpose is to destroy Iraq, not to remove Iraq from Kuwait.
Where do you pick up the signs?
Well, you look at the maps, you look at where they're striking, you look at where 10,000 sorties have gone, you look at the bombings. I waited for over an hour to hear someone talking about civilian casualties because the Iraqi planned it or the care. 302, we heard something about collateral damage. That's a euphemism for killing civilians, among other things. And in the answer, they said, well, we think we've missed historic monuments. Talk about terror. In the first 24 hours of the bombing, we unleashed 18,000 tons. The bomb over Hiroshima was 13,000 tons. Since then, we have devastated all parts of the country, as far as you can tell, if these Pentagon officials are telling us the truth.
Mr. Clark, can I interrupt you just for 1 second? Yesterday, the Iraqi ambassador to the United Nations released some casualty figures to the Security Council, and they were extremely low. You cite thousands, he cites hundreds. Do you think the Iraqis just don't want to tell the rest of the world what's going on?
I've been through this a lot of times. I went to Grenada right after the invasion. I went to Tripoli after we bombed there. I went to Panama, and both sides want to minimize casualties. One, because the victims don't want to seem that vulnerable, so they minimize them. And those who are doing the bombing don't want to seem that bloody, so they minimize them. But you talk to refugees coming into to Oman or any place in Jordan or in Iran, you talk to the press in West Europe that has communications with people that are in Iraq, and you know that you can't have 10,000 sorties in all those places. I mean, it may look like a building, but their superintendents, their houses nearby. How many airports have you seen that don't have shanties around them? We're killing a lot of civilians, I'll guarantee you that.
I don't even mean to imply for a second either that hundreds of casualties are acceptable, but
we're talking about thousands of casualties. They're not acceptable. It's not necessary. You know, we could have talked.
When General Powell says, as he does today, trust me,
well,
do you not believe him?
Yeah, of course I can't believe him. How can we believe him? Do we remember the body counts in Vietnam? How can you believe him? He talked about this as a party. Did you hear him call this war a party twice?
No, I didn't, sir.
Well, he did. He called it a party. God help us, it's no party. They're killing men, women, and children. We're losing Americans. We're losing allies. It's no party. It was a very genial affair, the way they described it, very antiseptic. But let me tell you, if you want to know about terror, you ought to be standing in Iraq tonight. There are thousands of planes coming over, and they're bombing the hell out of the place.
Mr. Clark, thank you for taking the time. We're also joined this afternoon by ABC's resident Middle East analyst, Judith Kipper, who can give us some sense, she is not long back from the region, as to how you think the campaign is affecting the region overall. Judith?
I think people in the Arab world and probably in Israel also are still in a state of shock. What continues to strike me is that America's two special relationships, Saudi Arabia and Israel, are now under attack by a common enemy, and both Saudi Arabia and Israel are both being protected by the United States, and that's a kind of new conglomeration of forces, and maybe in the post-war period we're going to see some shifts in the balance there.
Okay, Julie, would you stand by for a second? We want to go to Israel for a brief update there. Bill Siemens?
Peter, the Emergency Information Channel on both television and radio has just broadcast the order to the nation that the nation can take off their gas masks, the public can take off their gas masks, but we must stay inside the sealed rooms. So there is still some danger. They have not told us what set off the alarms. There is no information yet about any hits, if any.
Thank you, Bill Siemens, who is in Jerusalem this evening. You heard the former Attorney General Ramsey Clark on the subject of civilians. Here is the Commander-in-Chief of Allied Forces in the region, today in an interview on the subject of civilians. This whole thing could be over in a couple of days, he said, if we, assumedly he means the U.S., were the type of nation that chose to unleash all of our power without regard to the innocent civilians that would be killed. You know, and if we didn't care about the destruction of an entire nation, we could do that easily and have this whole thing wrapped up in a matter of days. Let's go to Saudi Arabia and Sam Donaldson.
Well, Peter, quite clearly something out of the ordinary has happened here in Tehran, and I mean by out of the ordinary, of course, we've had Scud attacks almost every night. The Patriots have done their work in an extraordinarily perfect fashion. But tonight, off to my left, and I know you can't see it, from the hotel where we're standing, where the air base is, there was a very low, loud intercept-type explosion, and a great number of emergency vehicles have now congregated. I can look across one of the runways, which is often used by our warplanes, and see that there are emergency vehicles congregated over there. I can't tell you what that means. Did the Scud actually hit the ground? I don't know. Was it a low intercept and a lot of debris, as occurred in Riyadh just the other night? I don't know that, but I do know that it's something a lot more out of the ordinary than we've suffered from these Scud attacks to date.
Okay, Sam Donaldson in eastern Saudi Arabia. Want to go to the White House briefly for ABC's Brit Hume. Brit, the Secretary of Defense said at the beginning of that briefing, you cannot score the war every evening. A clear allusion, I thought, to the television evening news, but I wonder whether or not the White House felt any pressure to bring the country up to date at the end of 7 days, or whether it was just a matter of course.
No, I think, Peter, that there was pressure felt by the administration to bring the country and us in the media up to date, not just because of the feeling that we're entitled to the information, but also because of the feeling that the news play, given the Scud attacks and certain of the other aspects of the war, the political side of it, was beginning to overbalance the coverage given to the supposedly successful military capacity.
You're not the best source in this, and nor for that matter am I, but the pressure isn't necessarily just from the press. In some respects, it's also come out of the administration, this sense of accomplishment itself, hasn't it?
Well, I think that's true, Peter, although it should be remembered that that first day's exhilaration about the lack of U.S. casualties and the apparent success of all of those air raids was immediately matched, or at least reacted to, by the president right in this very room when he came in and said there should be no euphoria, this is going to take some time. And indeed, Peter, the word you hear around here about the duration of this campaign is not weeks, the word is months.
Well, I was going to say that, in fact, the Secretary this afternoon, I thought, may have put himself in a little bind when he said it won't take that long. What does that long mean at the White House?
That was my first question when I heard him say it. What indeed does he mean by that? But I think that, Peter, if we're trying to look at realistic parameters for this in terms of the politics of trying to sustain support for it, we're probably looking toward the hot months, toward the season of the year when it is extremely difficult to hold forces together in the desert. And I think that that's the situation in which this administration does not want to see its army involved in fighting in that part of the world.
Okay, Brit Hume at the White House, thanks very much. We should also point out the Secretary a little earlier had hedged on a number of things, quite logically, one assumes, and he warned us all that the Iraqi army may have surprises for the U.S. or the Allied military in store. Now let us talk, if I may, first to Tony Cordesman again about the Iraqi army in Kuwait. If I can go to my notes here, there was a quote there, Tony Cordesman, from General Powell, which some people will take certainly as pretty terse. We have a simple strategy: cut it off and then kill it. How complicated is that?
Well, he went on to say it's very complicated. You know, a lot of people right now are asking whether the glass is half full or half empty, and what General Powell clearly said is we've just started pouring. We've changed from an air war designed to give us freedom of action in the air to one to allow us to kill targets in detail. And we're not talking now hundreds of targets, we're talking thousands. Many buried, many sheltered, and General Powell described each of the techniques involved. Our success rate is going to go down in terms of lethality per sortie because it's hard to kill individual tanks. It's hard to kill individual shelters when they're dispersed over wide areas. And he mentioned, Peter, the equivalent of 40 divisions. So I would think that we are going to see day after day of trying to kill not all of those targets, but a large enough percentage to either greatly reduce their military capability or even force them to give up.
Now, Tony Cordes, General Trainer, a lot of us don't understand those maps when we look at them with their sort of veins coming down through Iraq, rivers and roads and rail lines all the way into Kuwait. How easily can the Iraqis maneuver, say at night, in terms of getting supplies to their troops at the front?
Well, of course, they would prefer to use their main roads, Peter, but they're adept, and the terrain in many instances allows them to get off the road. Now, it varies by area. If you're in the region which is very moist, particularly in the rainy season, you're going to get bogs. But other areas, the sand is hard, and you can get off the road, and it's just like a highway. So the business of interdicting, that is cutting off a supplies going south prior to killing them, you know, it's sort of like the admonition that you buy low and sell high. It's nice advice, and it's a nice way to go about it, but the difficulty is in fact doing it. So I think the work of the Air Forces in interdicting the supply lines is a formidable one.
Again, I don't think you are necessarily the best source on this one, but you heard the former Attorney General Ramsey Clark saying he had heard all this enthusiasm from the military before. So how, as a former military man, but also a former journalist, how would you caution the public to listen to this briefing?
Well, as I said at the outset, Peter, I think it was kind of a reinsurance briefing that all is going well. But to give the devil his due over there in the Pentagon, if I can use that phrase, they have been warning against too much optimism, euphoria, and trying to lay out a scenario that this is going to be a long and difficult campaign, but the outcome is not in doubt. So I don't think that there's going to be any deliberate attempt to lie, but there may be some restriction on the amount of information they do provide, probably for good reason.
Okay, thank you very much, General Trainer, and also Tony Cordesman from now. Just before we go off and try to get some feel for how this plays politically on Capitol Hill, I can tell you that in Jerusalem now, ABC's Bill Siemens says that the tension has lifted. The emergency television and radio of the Israeli Defense Forces, the Israeli military, that is, said people that can come out of their gas-sealed rooms. So the pressure is lifting there, as Sam Donaldson told us it is in Dhahran in eastern Saudi Arabia, and there's been no indication yet that anything landed in Riyadh in central Saudi Arabia. But it does continue to be that weapon with which so many people, both here and away and overseas, are preoccupied, the weapon the Secretary referred to as the instrument of terror. On Capitol Hill, ABC's Cokie Roberts, we haven't talked to you in a few days, so I wonder how the war has been playing, say, over the last 2 or 3 days up there, and how this briefing, you think, plays into it.
Well, I think that there has been a tremendous demand for information here as well, in a sense that what people are hearing in their own briefings, the private, secret briefings, is no different than from what they're hearing on television, and that they wanted to get more information, and also a sense that things are not going as swimmingly as they seemed in the first few days. And of course, what you have to keep in mind on Capitol Hill is that their main responsibility, now that they've authorized this use of force, is to provide the funds for this operation. And as members of Congress hear the words about a longer war, don't expect it to be over soon, they see dollar signs in front of their eyes. You have people saying, members of Congress claim that the Tomahawk missiles cost more than $1 million each, and that in the first few days, hundreds of them were being used every day. You have estimates about the daily cost of this war ranging from the chairman of the Federal Reserve, Alan Greenspan, yesterday saying it was under $500 million a day. The chairman of the House Budget Committee saying it was somewhere between $500 million and $750 million a day. And Sam Nunn, the chairman of the Senate Armed Services Committee, saying, well, it's almost $1 billion a day. Well, if it goes on for a while, at close to $1 billion a day, you're talking about $28 billion, according to Senator Nunn, for a month's war, $86 billion for a 3-month war, and they're worried about where they're going to get the money.
Well, the other thing, Cokie, is that no politician worth his salt at the moment is going to really dig in his heels and say we're not going to pay for it at the moment, correct?
Absolutely not, and they're very cautious about saying we'll give our troops all the support they can possibly need. They're worrying that they might have to re-up the orders for all of these missiles, that they might be running out of them, and that they have made it very clear that they will provide, but they'd also like to see some allies provide, and instead of going around, as they say, with the tin cup, that our diplomats should be saying,
ante up this percentage of the cost, not whatever you can give would be lovely.
Is there a tendency on Capitol Hill to want to put more pressure on Saudi Arabia and Kuwait for dollars?
No question about it. Some say that they should be paying a third of the cost. The other allies a third and us a third. That's one formula you hear. A lot of resentment against Germany and Japan, and I think that's a theme that you'll hear a lot more.
Okay. Sorry, Koki. Thanks very much indeed. Koki Roberts on Capitol Hill. Just before we leave, you want to go back to Eastern Saudi Arabia. Quick comment from Sam Donaldson. Sam?
Well, Peter, I think what you're seeing now are some emergency vehicles about 2,000 yards away, where we heard this very loud explosion, which was either a low intercept or a Scud hitting the ground. But we have one on videotape that we want to show you that occurred right above the hotel. There it is, another intercept by one of the Patriot missiles. I can't tell you how many Scuds came in. I think at least 2, but there may have been more than that. There are helicopters in the air now, and the chemical teams are out and have made some suggestion that they really want to check this one out to see whether there was any gas or chemical warhead contained. But it was high explosive, certainly the one I heard. Peter?
Sam, you mentioned something that I haven't heard you talk about before. You said the chemical teams are out. Every time a Scud appears to be incoming, chemical teams go out to check out the air?
Yes, every time a Scud comes down, actually hits the ground, or there is significant debris, the chemical teams go out. There is a word that's come around the hotel, but I can't tell you its source, that the teams this time actually think that they want to be very careful about this one. Of course, there was the high explosive explosion, but with the intercept from the rocket, we're not certain whether that was the warhead or whether that was the intercept.
Okay, Sam Donaldson, Eastern Saudi Arabia, thank you very much. No, not necessarily by way of reassurance, but I want to go back to my notes here and see what I thought General Powell said. Tony Cordesman, help me here for a second. I thought I heard General Powell say in this briefing that there is no example that they know of where the Iraqis have successfully married a chemical weapon to a Scud missile. Am I correct?
No, I think we have to be very careful. If there's no example where they have used one in combat, what you would imply there, Peter, is they've never conducted any research and development activity to test one, and General Powell did not say that.
What did he say? Or was it Secretary Cheney about?
No, I think they were both very careful to say that they had
Tony, hear my notes. Excuse me for interrupting you. It was the Secretary who said the Iraqi, when asked if the U.S. would respond in kind with chemical weapons, quote, he has never married chemical weapons and ballistic missiles. What does that tell us?
Well, I think it tells us that they have never used one in combat.
Oh, okay.
I think if we went back, it does not refer to possible research and development.
Okay, thank you very much. Tony Cordesman again. Let's go briefly to Jerusalem. ABC's Bill Siemens. Yes, Bill.
Peter, that steady siren in the background is an all clear, just sounding now for the whole country. It's an all clear signal for the whole country right now.
Okay, thanks very much, Bill. By the way, General Powell did say that Patriot missile that was fired in Israel the other day, which did not make contact with a Scud, that's the one that landed in Tel Aviv, in which 3 people died as a result of having had heart attacks in the wake of the explosion, but almost 100 people were injured. Many of them likely it was the Israeli Defense Force, the IDF, as he called it, which fired that Patriot, not the Americans. And a final comment now from ABC's Bob Zelnick at the Pentagon. Bob, we've heard, I said this very extensive on the record briefing. Is this also the temperature and the response you're picking up in the back rooms and the halls of the Pentagon?
Very much so, Peter. The most striking thing to me was the difference in attitude on the part of the military here as opposed to the general public about Iraq's lack of military activity. Inside the building, the military regards it as a positive sign that Iraq is using only 5 of its 50-some-odd airfields, that it's launching only 30-some-odd sorties as opposed to more than 100 in a week before the war began. Outside the building, people seem to be worried about a rope-a-dope strategy and him saving his big stuff for later.
Okay, Bob Zelnick at the Pentagon, thank you very much. Lots of way we could sum up. Use just the 2 comments, one from the Secretary of Defense, who said that the first week of Desert Storm had gone very well, and General Powell, who said he is very pleased with week 1, but they, along with the President, advise us, as they advise you, to be cautious. This may yet be a long campaign. We'll have a complete wrap-up at home and overseas during an extended...
We believe this is the first air battle of the war to produce a double kill by a single pilot.
And those Iraqi planes may have been on their way to bomb U.S. ships in the Persian Gulf. Scenes of devastation in Baghdad. These are some of the first pictures cleared by Iraqi sensors showing damage caused by the heavy bombing there. Allied planes have pummeled Iraqi installations and facilities for 8 days straight now. Baghdad radio says there were 25 Allied raids Thursday night alone. And Iraqi gunners have shot down 7 Allied planes or missiles. It gave no details. To date, Iraq says more than 100 civilians have been killed, more than 200 wounded since the war began. Saddam Hussein's palace in Baghdad was one of the first targets hit by Allied bombing in the Gulf War, but all those bombs may have had little or no impact on Saddam, literally. He apparently has built himself an elaborate bunker. Reed Galen tells us Saddam may be safe underground and his elite troops may be protected too.
The German press reports that below the presidential palace in Baghdad, now probably destroyed by Allied bombs, Saddam Hussein constructed a $100 million fortress, an elaborate bunker 60 feet below the ground. Reportedly has walls of reinforced concrete 6 feet thick and rests on a hard rubber foundation to cushion vibrations from explosions above. Bunta magazine says it was built in the 80s with the help of German engineers. And the newspaper Bild am Sonntag published photos it says were taken in the bunker. Accounts in the German press and other European newspapers differ somewhat in their descriptions, but generally begin to resemble something out of Lifestyles of the Rich and Infamous, indicating that while staff quarters are Spartan, Saddam himself relaxes in luxury, with such touches as sparkling chandeliers and French-style furniture. And Saddam's hideaway may not be the only one. The Pentagon has released videotape it says shows an American bomb going right into the middle of Iraqi defense headquarters. But the Sunday Times of London reports that every government building built in Baghdad since the late 70s has an underground bunker. And some of Saddam's troops are also likely protected underground. British engineer Colin Croft, chairman of the Federation of Nuclear Shelter Consultants and Contractors, says that in the mid-'80s, his organization designed bunkers for the Iraqis, each to house 1,200 troops with provisions. He believes the Iraqis may have built enough of them to hide more than 40,000 troops in the desert.
These units could be in the ground. We don't know where they are. Our own forces could probably walk over these units, and the Iraqi soldiers could come up behind.
And how much of Saddam's bunker is likely still intact?
100%. You would need a nuclear device to take that bunker out.
U.S. military commanders say only that they do not know where Saddam is, but admit he still has command and control of his forces, perhaps through an elaborate network of communications connecting his bunker to his forces around Iraq and Kuwait. Reed Galen, Channel 5 Eyewitness News.
And it seems Saddam is taking no chances with his family either. A London newspaper is reporting Saddam's family is staying in Zambia right now at a well-guarded house belonging to President Kenneth Kaunda. The Zambian government denies that report. 4 CBS journalists covering the Persian Gulf War are missing today. A Saudi military patrol came upon their abandoned car near the northern Saudi border. Among the missing crew is Bob Simon, a veteran Middle East correspondent with CBS. Also missing are his producer, cameraman, and sound technician. A CBS spokesman says it's his expectation that the crew is with friendly forces, but the men's whereabouts is unknown right now. The crew was working apart from the press pool that's been covering the war. Air power is still the #1 weapon of choice for the United States and its allies. James Hattori looks at how that strategy is working so far.
Air Force bombers are getting a better look at their targets. Cloudy weather, which obscured much of Iraq's border with Kuwait and frustrated pilots earlier this week, seems to be clearing.
Looks good. Target area is supposed to be good, and we got good results this morning, and we expect the same this afternoon.
National Guard F-16 pilots today noted a sharp reduction in anti-aircraft artillery. They returned to base from a morning sortie with empty bomb rails, having delivered their ordnance as planned. Military officials say BDA, bomb damage assessment, will determine if the missions achieved their objectives.
I think we're doing good. We're starting to get some BDA and some good reports. We do get some pictures. It's usually several days, late. We get some feedback, verbal feedback from the senior leaders when they say, hey, yeah, you blew this up.
Pilots are getting a lot of feedback about Iraqi Scud missiles, fixed site, mobile, and decoys. They remain a high priority. High enough this night to enlarge the sortie of F-15 Strike Eagles in the wake of Iraqi missile attacks against Israel. James Hattori with the 4th Tactical Fighter Wing, Central Saudi Arabia.
And the Space Shuttle Discovery is getting ready for its next mission, and its crew says it will look for signs of the Mideast war as it passes over the Persian Gulf. Discovery is due for takeoff February 26th. Mission Commander, Navy Captain Michael Coates, says so far they have not been asked to do surveillance for the Defense Department, and he doubts they'll see much evidence of the war, but they will look for smoke plumes and other large clues as they pass overhead. The shuttle's stated mission is observing gas and chemical plumes not related
for a fight before all is quiet. Here are the day's developments. Waves of U.S. planes used the clear morning skies to guide more bombing missions. To date, the U.S. has launched 15,000 sorties. Military officials report 2 Allied planes down today. The pilot of one bailed out safely over the Gulf. Saudi jets shot down 2 Iraqi fighters. They were headed toward the Allied ships in the Gulf. Japan boosts the Allied effort by $9 billion. And the USS Forrestal joins Operation Desert Storm. It's believed the carrier is headed to the Red Sea after leaving Mayport Naval Station in Florida. And U.S. forces hold 29 Iraqi prisoners of war. The American flag is
trembled, and I heard the heavens roar.
I'm Richard Brown.
And I'm Ana Chavez. They put their lives on the line every time they speak aloud about the Iraqi invasion. And in spite of that, the Kuwaiti resistance is speaking with a voice heard all around the world.
You understand what you're going through. But you can see what kind of person we're dealing with here. He hits civilian targets, doesn't care, and if we let him be in Kuwait, Kuwait will be demolished very, very soon.
By satellite telephone, they send information to the Allied forces and work with U.S. specialists to try to break the morale of Iraqi soldiers.
It's what you have is your food stock, and that's it. You have to rely on it until the things, you might finish.
You're saying you'll run out of food in how long?
In 2 weeks.
Does that worry you?
No. I want my country to be free. I don't care about food.
The resistance speaks to the Iraqis and to the American people.
You can obviate that war was the only thing to get them out of Kuwait. Don't be misinformed about that this war is for oil. No. Blood for human beings. And that's what it should be.
There will be more on the Kuwaiti resistance on tonight's edition of Nightline. Richard?
All over the world, there are people listening for those voices from the Persian Gulf. Ham radio operators are tuning into Kuwait, tuning into Baghdad. Channel 7's Ed Leslie was with one ham operator tonight who tried to make the connection.
Iraqi forces could prove a major...
High on a hilltop in Los Altos Hills, ham radio operator Smitty Smithwick monitors the events taking place in and near the Gulf War. When possible, he talks with friends in Israel and elsewhere and passes on emergency family information to stateside relatives. He tried to get through to Baghdad tonight, but because of the bombing there, most likely, amateur radios there were silent.
The Iraqi stations I have not been able to hear personally, and I understand the signal in the West Coast is very weak. We're told either that, and their power, of course, has been out, and they probably, my supposition is that they've been on emergency power, perhaps for the last several days if the station's around Iraq, and that would account for a weak signal.
Jordan's King Hussein, as it turns out, is an avid ham. Obviously too busy to pursue the hobby, however, he hasn't been heard from lately, at least not on this side of the world. Americans here are buying up ham radios in hopes of hearing uncensored accounts from the embattled area. But as Smithwick can tell you, even the experts can't get through on nights like tonight.
Even Israel's not very strong now.
In Los Altos Hills, Ed Leslie, Channel 7 News Tonight.
The signal they're trying to reach is 11-830. Allied forces are hammering Iraq by air, by sea, and by land. U.S. Marines fired into southern Kuwait tonight to take out an Iraqi rocket battery. They fired 155mm howitzer shells at their target. The Marines withdrew before the Iraqis returned fire. They fired as many as 12 rounds. There are no reports of any American casualties. U.S. officials believe the Iraqis have used the rocket battery in the past week to fire on Marine positions across the Kuwaiti border.
We've had a lot of problems down in our area of operation because of all these multiple rocket launchers that have been hitting us various position to position. Luckily, we haven't had anybody hurt yet, but they are harassing us. So we came up here to take care of them.
That was your target tonight?
That's affirmative. We tried to hit those multiple rocket launchers tonight. We had a pretty good grid on them, so I'm sure we hit them.
It was the second time this week Marine units fired on the Iraqi position in southern Kuwait.
Iraq launched a counteroffensive through its media today. Iraqi radio calling the U.S. military cowards for relying on a bombing campaign rather than ground warfare. Iraq also claimed, for a second day, that civilians are being killed in the heavy bombing. It did not provide numbers, but it did show these pictures from Iraqi television. Iraq says the pictures are of damage in Baghdad and in 2 other cities. They were cleared for release by Iraqi censors. Refugees from those areas are continuing to flood into Jordan, where a majority of people condemn the bombing and support Saddam Hussein.
We did not invade California. We're standing on our land. This is our oil.
Our leaders have been puppets to the states and to the superpowers in general. They play with us like a chess game.
More than 2,000 people a day are arriving at the Jordanian border camps.
In a dogfight over Saudi Arabia's eastern coast today, a lone Saudi jet pilot shot down 2 Iraqi fighters loaded with bombs. The Iraqi Mirage fighter planes apparently were preparing to launch Exocet missiles against Allied warships in the Gulf when they were intercepted by Saudi F-15s. We have tape of one of the Saudi pilots as he rolled his jet behind the Iraqi planes.
We got bandits, both target destroyed, both target destroyed.
Copy, both flags.
That's affirmative.
There, I wasn't feeling any fear. I was confident. I know what I'm doing. I know I'm protecting my country. There is no time or place to feel fear there.
The air battle is believed to mark the first time Iraq's Air Force has ventured into Saudi airspace since the war began last week.
The U.S. Navy scored a victory as the war entered its second week. It sunk an Iraqi minesweeper in the Persian Gulf off Kuwait, captured 51 Iraqis, and reclaimed a small Kuwaiti island. It all happened on the same mission. The small island of Garu is nothing more than a rock in the ocean, but it belongs to Kuwait, and Iraqi soldiers were on it. After the minesweeper was sunk, U.S. Navy helicopters from USS Kurtz were taking Iraqi prisoners out of the water. And then
the U.S. helicopter encountered small arms fire from a nearby island. The helicopter engaged hostile forces on the island, resulting in the capture of additional EPWs. Reports indicate that 3 Iraqi personnel were killed in this encounter, and a total of 51 EPWs have been taken into custody.
U.S. military officials say the second Iraqi minesweeper involved in the action sank when it hit one of its own mines.
As the daily bombardment continues, there remains the question of how badly Iraq's military might is being damaged. For the most part, Iraqi forces remain out of sight in fortified bunkers. Western experts who helped build the bunkers say Saddam started work on them in 1981. Some are several levels deep and may be sheltering Iraq's elite Republican Guard. Apparently, there's a huge luxury bunker beneath the presidential palace. Experts say it includes 6,000-pound steel doors, an air and water filtration system, and it's designed to withstand a nuclear attack.
It can absorb the shock waves, and the bunker is able to move about 2 feet.
You could stay down the shelter indefinitely, depending on how long your food stock lasts and water. And providing your air filtration units acting, you stay down there for years.
And Allied forces also may have problems locating targets above ground. The Iraqis may be using decoys, everything from dummy tanks to plastic missiles with a heat source to fool infrared sensors. And one more news today where the FBI Director William Sessions said an adequate anti-terrorist program is already in place. He also said other law enforcement agencies are doing their part at likely targets like the Super Bowl.
I think we ought to go about our business as usual. I've stated that before. I think you ought to rely upon your law enforcement people. I think you ought to rely upon your FBI.
Sessions said the FBI is monitoring U.S. supporters of international terrorist groups. He said so far U.S. terrorist activity is low in comparison to other countries.
Martin Watt.
It was defend Saudi Arabia.
We're here to protect freedom. We're here to protect our future. And we are here to protect innocent life.
Then the rallying cry was Free Kuwait.
The invasion of Kuwait was without provocation. The looting of Kuwait is without excuse, and the occupation of Kuwait will not stand.
Now the goals may be expanding to bring about the downfall of Saddam Hussein.
There can be no pause now that Saddam has forced the world into war. We will stay the course, and we will succeed all the way.